I think
Do you remember?
the bigger factor, it was troops, it was sandbag fortifications, it was artillery pieces, and it was mines. What the what that campaign, Operation Citadel, or it's not really a campaign, that operation was delayed repeatedly by Hitler because he insisted on using the new Panther tanks, which
Yeah.
were admittedly really great tanks, but Manstein says he overestimated the effect that new weapons would have. I mean, new weapons are nice, but you rarely have such a huge revolution, in a matter of months that it necessarily matters a whole lot to delay an operation like that. But what they did was they filled sort of their front lines with mines. And the Germans basically they built these these remote controlled cars, really like decades ahead of their time, and they would drive these cars into the minefields and blow up the mines as the cars drove over the mines. And these are like fairly small electric power radio controlled cars, and they cut a path through the minefield with these little cars, but it takes a while to do that, and while you're doing that, the Red Army is shelling the hell out of your forces, and you're plowing through a minefield, and you're exposed to fire on your east and your west because you're pushing into this a bulge in the front that goes from east to west. So you're trying to go from the north to the south and from the south to the north to cut it off so that you can trap these soldiers, and then basically they called it a kessel, a kettle. You'd have this pocket, and you just bomb it and lob artillery shells in, and they couldn't get reinforcements, and eventually you'd get a huge victory. But I think the minefields and the artillery was the big cost for the Germans in terms of delaying Kursk.
So the Russians were laying mines while Hitler was making Manstein wait for these stupid bespoke vehicles that he had an obsession for.
Yeah, exactly. They were very cool
Yeah.
in Hitler's defense, but Hitler just wasn't
No,
a
they look
professional.
cool. I don't think. He was an artist. I think he had this aesthetic sense
Yeah,
of everything, and I don't think he had a numerical sense of much. Unfortunately for the German military, because the numbers win the fucking war. I mean, if your fighter planes look cooler than the other guy, there's a slight edge, but if you've got half the number, sorry, you're going to lose. So,
yeah. Hitler only wanted to win if he could look good doing it, whereas Manstein just wanted to win.
Yeah, the whole aesthetic aspect that especially as he got kind of more and more into his amphetamine psychosis and megalomania, that I'm happy to kind of immolate to the entire country because that's essentially more dramatic than a negotiated surrender at a firing squad.
That's interesting. I've never heard that interpretation of why he did that. I think it was just more like he wanted to shift blame on the Germans for the loss rather than take it himself. But he bore a lot of that blame, I think, to everybody's understanding in the later years of the war, which actually brings me to a question about the von Stauffenberg coup attempt, which he had invited Manstein to join. So this, for the listeners, this is the coup that was portrayed by Tom Cruise in the movie Valkyrie. And I don't remember what year it was, maybe 44, 43, something like that.
It was
But,
44, I think. Early 44,
yeah,
I think.
But they were able to plant a suitcase bomb in one of Hitler's briefing outposts in, I think it was Poland or Ukraine or somewhere like that in the Eastern Front, and it barely missed him. But they were all shot, and the guys basically failed. But one of their strategies was to do this assassination, and then in the confusion actually seize the government back in Berlin. And I think they wanted to have as much military support as possible, because that way they could enforce the martial law and the government takeover. But I wanted to ask you, Ajax, what your thoughts are why Manstein did not join that coup after he was invited, and he also didn't tell Hitler of the invite either. So he was sort of on the fence a little bit in my interpretation. But what were his reasons?
So I've looked it up here. It's the July 20 plot. So it's pretty late in the war at this point. I mean, the war is essentially lost at this point. It's kind of not that far off from when Manstein ends up getting the boot, getting kicked out of his command. But presumably he was contacted earlier. He doesn't talk about it in the book, as I remember, not at any length at least. But let's say he's getting contacted in early 43, which is after Stalingrad and after it really becomes apparent that Hitler's overstepping his bounds as commander. I still think that in early 43, Manstein thought that he could reason with Hitler. He thought, because he occasionally was able to get Hitler to relent, like Hitler basically left him alone after Stalingrad to do this heroic effort to seal the front back up in the southern, eastern Ukraine. So and then also Hitler left him alone in the Crimea campaign earlier in 41. So he thought that he could, if he badgered Hitler enough, that he could be given. I think he expected to be given full control of the Eastern Front, or at least someone like him to be given full control, and that they could cobble together something close to a victory, at least keep the Russians out of Germany. And so, also keep in mind that he's part of this like aristocratic tradition, this like Prussian military tradition, wherein they have this idea that like the individual soldier is responsible for his area. Like the soldier's encouraged to think on his own, and the general is encouraged to participate in the front himself, to go to the front and see the men and be exposed to some risk. But at the same time, the general is just a general. Like the general doesn't interfere in political matters, and I think that ultimately he just wasn't the sort to rebel. Like his sense of duty was too strong.
My sort of brief research on this led me to one main reason, and this may be connected, but and you mentioned this before, that Manstein thought he could actually win if Hitler let him do what he needed to do, or at least fight to a draw, not necessarily win, but negotiate something after they're able to hold off the Allies. But he basically said that if he had gone and supported this coup and in effect asked people to disobey orders, the Eastern Front would collapse, because that precedent of having a high-ranking officer support something like this would have just created a breakdown in the chain of command, and everybody would have just fallen apart. And you could argue that that would lead to the loss of the war, and it could lead to loss of quite a few lives as well. So was that any of your interpretation, that he was sort of trying to do the lesser of two evils by not basically collapsing the entire military effort, and in doing so trying to save Germany, rather than just cutting off this man who had seemingly gone insane and who wasn't doing a very good job leading the country, but then the aftermath is worse, kind of thing.
Well, yeah, there's that aspect there. Like they're fighting this desperate struggle on the Eastern Front. So the idea of like pulling troops off the Eastern Front. I mean, I don't even know that if he had ordered his men to withdraw, that maybe they would have shot him or arrested him.
Well, that wasn't quite the point. It was more just like the word would have gotten out that there was a coup and that Manstein was supporting it, and then that basically would have created this sort of general mutiny everywhere, that nobody knew what to do, and it was just chaos. Yeah,
and then you would get another stab in the back type of narrative going, where the Germans were holding enemy territory, even though they were in a hopeless position. They were holding enemy territory. Say in like early 44 or any time in 43, they assassinate Hitler, then they negotiate something. Then, yeah, it would have to be a really well negotiated deal to sort of avoid any sort of repeat of the stab in the back story.
Yeah,
but I still think he could have. I mean, he met with Hitler. I mean, he could have. I don't know, like picked up a protractor from the map and stabbed him with a whatever. Maybe I'm forgetting what a protractor is. Actually, I take that back. I was thinking a compass.
Right.
But
right.
or whatever. He could have had Hitler killed. I think he had access to him. Maybe that would have worked. I mean,
but to be fair, so did a whole lot of other people. So I mean, that we're fixating on this one person, I think, is probably a little bit unfair.
Sure, yeah. Well, the bigger question is, why didn't more German officers go?
Yeah, so I have a thesis on that. Like, I don't think they really realized like what a annihilation this was going to actually turn into.
Yeah.
Like, because the withdrawal was actually like, I mean, you're talking about like fighting backwards for like essentially 2 years between 1943 and 1945, and like doing a fairly good job of it. Their casualty ratio was like obscenely low. They were really like churning through Russians, even in 1945. So like if you compare what happened kind of at the end of World War I, when their entire country was crushed, but they were able to negotiate something where there were no troops essentially on German soil. They were only occupied for a very brief portion of time. There were not, generally speaking, these mass trials of like the entire leadership cast. I think that they thought that there were a lot higher odds of being able to kind of have a negotiated settlement with the current civil government, like with the Nazis and the Soviets and the Allies. And that ended up being, like, in retrospect, very unrealistic.
Right. So that makes me think of something I had always sort of wondered. Apparently, there was this episode. The details of what was actually being discussed escape me right now, but basically, Heinz Guderian was not agreeing with Hitler on some matter. And this is like fairly late in the war. I think this is 43 at least. And so Hitler essentially bribes him by giving him this great estate in Poland to agree with him. And it's like, what the hell good is an estate to me if it's 800 miles behind the Iron Curtain? They definitely didn't quite grasp just how steamrolled the eastern half of Germany was going to be.
I mean, even the western half was,
bombed
I
to
don't
hell,
recall the exact timeline, and a lot of these guys, may not have necessarily realized exactly how bad the bombing situation, for that matter, was. If they're very kind of concentrated on their particular and numerous problems, but even Western Germany was just like complete bomb to shit at this point.